Please be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSE Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Icann 70, Insights from the Virtual Meeting. My name is Tariq Hopkins, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to make a few announcements. You can enter your questions and comments in the Q&A widget at any time during your presentation. We have a lot of material to cover today, so we'll do our best to answer your questions, and we'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar if we do not have a chance to answer. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, we are happy to help you troubleshoot the problem. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. Joining us today is Gretchen Olive. Gretchen is Director of Policy and Global Domain Name Services for CSE. For nearly 2 decades, Gretchen has helped Global 2000 companies devise global domain name, trademark, and online brand protection strategies, and is a leading authority for the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers new gTLD program. And with that, let's welcome Gretchen.
Thanks, Tarek. Yes, we always with an Icann meeting have a busy agenda, and this session will be no exception. So we'll cover our usual Icann overview. We always have a few new people who join us, so I always like to make sure everybody understands kind of how Icann works. We'll dive into DNS abuse. We'll go through some key policy development process updates. We'll talk a little bit more about the Gak, and then we'll also talk about new gTLD round 2 and when that might be happening. So in terms of Icann meetings, as we've spoken about before, there's generally 3 public meetings that happen every year. The first one of the year, which this is, typically in the March timeframe, this is typically a 6-day format. Because we're still kind of all virtual at this point. Icann meetings are not happening in person; they're virtual. This was more of a 4-day format. They did have some pre-meetings before the week before, so it's a little bit different. But this is the meeting really known as the community forum, and this is very similar to kind of like the Icann meetings that have happened in the past. It's kind of I would call it a smattering of everything: some work group meetings, some high-interest topics. A lot of discussion around kind of what we're trying to get done. All right, so now that we know what meeting we're in, now let's talk a little bit about Icann as an organization, or really what it kind of means to be the Icann community. So Icann, the organization, is kind of made up of staff, president, CEO. They also report to a board of directors. There's an ombudsman. That's a little bit unusual. Most corporations don't have that. But then you have all these kind of blue and gray boxes below the kind of blue bar at the top. And these are different supporting organizations and advisory committees where the policy work really happens. It's the blue boxes really where the policy work starts. Icann is a multi-stakeholder model. It is a consensus policy-driven organization. It comes from the bottom up and kind of bubbles up to the board of directors. And as that kind of unfolds, you have these kind of gray boxes to the right-hand side that are advisory committees. They're really tasked with advising the board, but more and more we're seeing them kind of provide inputs as the policy process is starting at sort of this kind of grassroots level. So you have the IETF there at the top. You also have the Security and Stability Advisory Council there in the middle. You also have the Root Server System Advisory Committee. And then kind of last but not least is the Governmental Advisory Committee, or the Gak, and we'll talk a fair amount about them as well this session. All right, so one of the kind of the largest topic of Icann 70 was DNS abuse, and we've seen this now the last, 3 to 5 meetings where DNS abuse is really the hot topic of the meeting. And it is continues to be, quite honestly, DNS abuse is a chronic and growing problem. Outside events, things like COVID, like natural disasters, like civil unrest, they really kind of amp things up when it comes to DNS abuse. People, the bad guys, the bad actors out there kind of see an opportunity in those kind of events. The common theme, though, is that, the DNS, the domain name system, is leveraged for illicit purposes. And it's cheap, it's easy, it's anonymous, and, it's kind of like the perfect storm, when it comes to kind of bad guys. They love this kind of low-cost, low-effort, big harm, big impact kind of model. There's lots of studies out there, but, one study says it's estimated, in this year alone, cybercrime will cost the global economy more than $6 trillion. And, that's only going to multiply, quite honestly. I've seen a bunch of estimates through, like, 2025, and it just continues to double, triple, quadruple. It is, the DNS is a globally scalable infrastructure, and it really helps these types of activities have a big impact at wide scale. So, the big challenge here is that governments, Icann and the Icann community, businesses, consumers, just Internet users, most of us, in all honesty, are truly unprepared and really not adequately dealing with these threats. These bad guys are a step ahead. And this is really the essence of the conversation that's going on, is trying to figure out, what is Icann's role in this as a governor, if you will, of the domain name system. So I guess, that leads us to the question of what is being done. And, right now it's very much a patchwork approach within Icann, the Icann community. I think it's always been, Icann has always struggled with, kind of where to draw the line. And in a lot of ways, I think the organization itself has tried to clearly state, they are really just the administrator of the technical identifiers, right? They are not responsible for content. They've said that over and over and over again. But this DNS abuse issue, it's just sort of, it collides everything that's been said and leaves, I think, a pretty big gray area. And so there's a lot of questions around Icann's remit. What about compliance? Isn't Icann compliance a tool that can help us, improve DNS abuse or mitigate DNS abuse? What about the kind of the adequacy and the availability of the tools that Icann has? For an organization that is the governor of the domain name system, they often don't seem to have the sort of the cutting edge tools necessary to really have the insights that one would expect. There's also coordination that's required between industry players, and registries and registrars are contracted parties with Icann, and so there's always this sort of like contractual framework between the parties, but the coordination piece isn't always doesn't always go great, quite honestly. It's because there's this contractual relationship and, each side wanting to be careful of liability and rights and responsibilities and things like that. So, combine that sort of grayness, if you will, with just overall awareness and understanding of DNS abuse not being particularly high. I think, there's certainly, a lot of people who know about online fraud and phishing and, counterfeiting and all these other things that happen online. But when you look across the globe at large, there's a very large population that does not have a real awareness of this. Most feel that Icann, the contracted parties, need to do more and, want to see them do more. We also want, specifically more tools to identify and to validate the abuse, as well as education and accountability. So, while all this has been kind of talked about, like I said, over with pretty good intensity over the last 3 to 5 Icann meetings, it's kind of gone in circles. There hasn't been, I would say, any concrete, like, this is what we can do to make things better, or this is what we should do, this is what we should work towards to make things better. And in the background, there's been one of the advisory committees I mentioned on that sort of organizational slide, the Security and Stability Advisory Committee, has been working on a report, not just for DNS abuse, but they put these reports together. This will be their second big report. It's Security and Stability and Resiliency report. They've been working on that, and as part of that report, there's been kind of high anticipation that this technical group could provide some kind of insights and some recommendations for, real concrete recommendations for what could be next. What should the Icann community be working on? What should Icann, the organization, be working on? What is that roadmap for the path forward? So that's been pretty highly anticipated over the last, I would say 4 to 6 months. So in the Icann world, we love our acronyms, so there should be no reason why we shouldn't have a really good set of acronyms for this report. So it's called the Ssr2 report. So Security Stability Advisory Committee, Security Stability Resiliency 2 report. So that's acronyms for the day. But basically, this report was delivered to the Icann board at the end of January, and it contains actually 63 recommendations. It's kind of grouped into a bunch of buckets. Like I said, this report wasn't completely, solely about DNS abuse. It's about some other kind of insights and kind of reviews done by the SAC. But so basically, they looked at the first report, SSR1. Implementation and kind of what were the intended effects, and looked at that. Then they looked at key stability issues within Icann. They looked at contracts, compliance, and transparency around DNS abuse, and also looked at additional security, stability, and resiliency, that's that SSR, related concerns regarding the global DNS. So the public comment on this runs until April 8th, and I provide the link here where you can see the report and the comments. Once the advisory committee issued the report, which was the end of January, then the board has 6 months to basically from receipt of the report to kind of review and consider the recommendations and kind of either accept them or reject them. They could also obviously ask questions as well. So really by the end of July, the Icann board should respond to this report. So for any recommendations they approve, the board is expected to kind of direct implementation, direct the Icann organization to work through implementation of the recommendations that they approve. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to start implementing and working on implementation like right then and there. It's subject to planning, scheduling, and prioritization. So basically all the competing priorities that Icann, the organization, is working on, this will then get sort of filled into that set of priorities and kind of put on the right ranking, if you will. Then if the recommendations of the board, any of those recommendations the board does not approve, the board is required to provide a written rationale for such action. And typically when that happens, there's some subsequent discussion and potentially, kind of wrangling over that. So we'll watch this carefully. But, this report definitely was sort of like chock full of things that, really can potentially help us as a community kind of get to, I would say, better mechanisms to deal with DNS abuse. I don't think the report is intended or will have the effect of totally mitigating DNS abuse, but I think there are some really good recommendations in this report. So let's go through some of the key SSR2 recommendations. Obviously, can't go through all 63 of them, but let's go through what I think are some of the key ones. One is Icann should commission a negotiating team that basically includes abuse and security experts, not affiliated with any of the contracted parties, and work to renegotiate the contracts to make sure that the security, stability, and resiliency of the DNS for end users, businesses, and governments is improved. So let's kind of break that down just a little bit, is that, what's often challenging in the ICANN world, like I mentioned before, is that, ICANN, the registries, the registrars, they're all contracted parties. And so there's sort of this kind of, I would call sort of arm's length dealing, yes, but it's a very kind of closed group. It's these everybody kind of knows each other. Look, CSC is a registrar. We're one of these parties, but we're very different than many other registrars. And in fact, over like 3,000 registrars around the world, we're like, one of a very small handful of registrars that just works with, corporations and their law firms. Most registrars are, dealing with the general public, small organizations, really operate a self-service business where you can go onto their platform, you can set up an account, and, you put a credit card in and off you go. It's a very closed group, if you will, that are always kind of working on these issues. And the thought of, kind of objective third parties that don't have kind of, a stake in everything and working through looking at the contracts and negotiating the contracts. Every registry signs effectively close to the same contract. Registrars all sign the same contract with ICANN. But having someone kind of from the outside maybe handle this and look at what should be the provisions that are in those contracts to improve the situation, I think is a really interesting idea. I suspect there's going to be some resistance to that, but I think that is a really a good idea. And another recommendation in terms of things that ICANN should do, it should strictly enforce the security, stability, and resiliency obligations, monitor and enforce registration data accuracy, and the external audit should be conducted against ICANN compliance. ICANN compliance conducts audits on registries and registrars, as they should, no problem. But one of the questions is okay, so how is ICANN compliance doing? I think there's some additional tools there, and that's definitely one of the recommendations the SAC had, because, again, there are over 3,000 accredited registrars around the globe. Now, some of them are kind of related to the same family of registrars, so it's not truly 3,000 individual players, but I think there's some additional accountability and transparency that's needed here, and I think this could really get to some of that. Another recommendation is to provide clarity on definitions of DNS abuse-related terms, and then identifying which abuse categories ICANN sees within or outside of its remit. Again, this is kind of that gray area I talked about. There's this, it's not our job, we don't want to cross the line, we're not responsible for content. And I'm not saying that, ICANN has any kind of bad intent here. I think that's been their position, all along. But the question is that as the kind of governor of the domain namespace, the identifiers, there has to be a role here for them to play. Maybe it's more of compliance and enforcement, but there needs to be more. There needs to be more tools. There needs to be kind of more clarity brought to this, exactly what they are responsible for and what their obligations should be, and not necessarily just being self-defined. There's also a recommendation to overhaul DNS abuse analysis and reporting. Again, looking for greater transparency, independent review, more reporting, so that there can be clarity as to where the bad guys are and who they're working with within the domain ecosystem, and looking at what are different registries and reports of what different registries and registrars are doing in response to these complaints of illegal or malicious conduct in using the DNS the way they are. So it is well known that there are some registrars out there that either harbor bad actors, like really enable them, and there's some registrars and registries that, they're like right up against the line, and they kind of, don't do everything that they could be doing to mitigate this abuse. And so, again, kind of having reporting around that and understanding who's doing what, I think, could be a really good path forward. Another recommendation is to basically increase the transparency and accountability around the abuse complaint reporting. How many reports are being made? What's being done with those complaints? How successful is Icann in resolving those issues, or do they just kind of like, sorry, not our job, fine, go talk to somebody else? There needs to be more granularity. There needs to be more, transparency and accountability here, and I completely agree that would be something that, should be not just kind of given lip service, but actually some work and implementation of, mechanisms that would lead to that. And just to kind of round out some of the key recommendations, another recommendation is that Icann should create kind of a temporary specification for evidence-based security improvements. So this would really require, kind of like thresholds, like in order to continue to be a registrar or registry in good standing, that you would have to maintain abusive domains under management below a certain threshold. And it would really require Icann to provide a list of these domains in each contracted party's portfolio, and tag them as abusive, notices to contracted parties when they exceed the thresholds, and also, consider financial incentives for being a good actor. That tends to really work in terms of encouraging certain behavior is that in financial incentives. So, maybe reduce costs or something like that can be something that Icann can look at for registrars who are, doing all the right things, or the registries that are doing all the right things. So I think this could be a very effective recommendation and something that really should be fleshed out. And then lastly is to launch, similar to what we've done on WHOIS in light of the General Data Protection Regulation, where there was an Epdp, an expedited policy development process launched to try to figure out what to do with the conflict between, Icann WHOIS policy and the General Data Protection Regulation. While the Epdp hasn't gone as expedited as everybody, I think, thought it would, I think, in Epdp on anti-abuse, kind of defining the countermeasures and remediation and the different types of abuse, I think definitely some very focused, kind of intense work schedule on this topic is really needed. The challenge is we're behind. The community is behind on this, and so it's really important to kind of, ramp up the activity, ramp up the policy work, ramp up, trying to get to, defined mechanisms and tactics and kind of different mechanisms that can be put in place to at least, better address. Again, I don't think that these things are going to magically make everything better, but I think it can help. And, it's kind of, unfortunate, but the truth of the matter is there's no quick answers here, and it's going to take everybody's vigilance. And I really, really encourage, our clients here online with us here tonight, like, you need to be vigilant in protecting your company and your customers. There is no silver bullet here. I know many people's security groups, they are doing amazing work, really trying to batten down the hatches and really try to protect the organization. A lot of times those efforts are very, very focused on things that are, inside the firewall, and it's really unfortunate in some ways that this domain system really sits outside the firewall, and there's kind of limited, I would say, insight that a lot of companies can see, things coming at them. But that's really why you hear us at CSC really talk about a defense in-depth approach, is because there is no one single silver bullet to kind of protect your domain portfolio, your other digital assets like, DNS and SSLs, all these things that kind of operate your business. There's no kind of silver bullet. You really need to just keep on wrapping multiple layers of security, what your security team is doing inside the firewall, as well as things you can be doing outside the firewall like registry lock and DNSSEC, CAA records, all sorts of things that, we offer our clients to make sure that they are doing everything possible to keep things, locked and protected and, all eyes on those assets, because the second you take your eye off of it, the second you think you have it all covered, that's when disaster seems to strike, and no one wants to be a headline, in the New York Times. So, Icann's going to do its work here. I'm would love to see it really ramp up, but there are no quick answers here, so we all need to really be vigilant. All right. Well, let's turn now to where we are on some very important policy development processes going on at Icann. So probably the one that we've been talking the most about over the last couple of years has been the Epdp, or the Expedited Policy Development Process, related to the WHOIS. And as I mentioned earlier, this was actually something this Epdp was something that Icann launched as a result of sort of the conflict between the Icann WHOIS rules and the General Data Protection Regulation. That was started to be enforced in May of 2018. And gosh, it seems like yesterday in some ways. But this Epdp was the first expedited policy development process that Icann had attempted in its kind of short, existence. But nonetheless, it was in response to the General Data Protection Regulation, which was really trying to harmonize data privacy laws across Europe and kind of protect and empower kind of EU citizens' data privacy. And what's unique about the GDPR is it's sort of, it is what they call extraterritorial. So it applies outside of the EU countries. And so if you're a company that's working with a European citizen, the GDPR is something that you need to pay attention to, because there are fines for noncompliance that are very, very substantial. So, Icann, for as long as I have been involved in Icann, which has been 20 years, which completely blows my mind every time I say that, we've been talking about WHOIS and the problems with WHOIS. And this finally made, in the past, Icann kind of just existed as if their WHOIS policy was the only thing in the world that mattered. But they had to recognize with the kind of enforceability of the GDPR that their WHOIS policy was not the real law of the land. And so they had to launch this expedited policy development process to try to kind of reconcile these things. And so they issued the temporary specification that kind of made it okay for WHOIS to get redacted to a large extent, so that they could work through policy development on, not only like what data elements should appear in a WHOIS record, but also how access should be granted to that record, because really up until that point, WHOIS was free and public, and every registrar had to provide, a WHOIS service to be able to allow people to look up kind of who is the licensee of a domain name. So it really turned things on its head. So the Epdp was broken initially into two phases. Phase one was about that collection and handling of the WHOIS contact data, what were the data elements, et cetera. And then phase two is about access to the WHOIS data by registries, registrars, Icann, other third parties like security investigators, IP holders, et cetera. The initial report was issued within the year time frame. It was issued in February 2019. A implementation review team was kind of formulated to kind of look at those recommendations and to kind of make them, work through the implementation. This has now continued on. I think a lot of people expected that kind of within a year of that report that there would be implementation. That didn't happen. I think some would say, maybe COVID got in the way a little bit, but quite honestly, that group is still working, and you'll hear a little later about how there are different parties within the Iken community that are really calling for them to kind of issue some kind of like defined timetable and milestones that they're going to reach. So we all know when this work is going to get done. It's not easy work, don't get me wrong, but I think people are a little confused about what exactly is being accomplished or has been accomplished and what is yet that they're still trying to achieve. So there's definitely a desire to get some clarity around that. There's also the Edp Phase Two, which officially began in May of 2019. This was after the Iken board kind of approved most of the initial report on Phase One, and they were trying to take it further. And really, one of the big kind of things that group worked on was System for Standardized Access and Disclosure. You'll hear it often referred to as SAD. Again, Icann loves its acronyms. Their initial report was published in February of 2020. There was another addendum in March, but then the final report was approved by the GNSO. That's the Generic Name Supporting Organization. Again, that bottom-up consensus policy kind of mechanism. You start with kind of work groups, and then that policy work goes up through the supporting organization that work group is sort of constituted from. And the GNSO approved it in October, and quite honestly, a lot of people were very confused and was kind of surprised that the GNSO so quickly, well, I won't say quickly, but seemed to approve it without a lot of reservations. Let's say that, because this SAD, or this mechanism for disclosure of WHOIS information, most people believe what has been kind of outlined is unworkable, is cost prohibitive, that is overly complex. Again, not easy work. In no way saying like this should have been a breeze, but unfortunately consensus is a really messy process. And I think even out of that group of people who worked on it, there were IP interests, business interests that were not so happy with what ultimately came out. So we're kind of stuck in a little bit of quicksand right now. So here I give you, kind of a little bit more detail about kind of what the different industry groups are saying about, the Epdp Phase 2 final report. There's a lack of support. I think that's probably the best way of saying it for this report. And the challenge is this is really important stuff. How people get access to WHOIS information for legitimate reasons, for those cybersecurity investigations, for other law enforcement, for IP interests. It is important that this system work and that we can get it up and running. Probably yesterday would have been the timing, but nonetheless, that's, we need to get this up and running. And so, what's been interesting is after this report came out and kind of this kind of general consensus that this is probably not the best way of going about this. Icann has now kind of introduced some new processes that are going to need to happen before they approve it. In addition to, and we'll talk about those kind of new processes in a few minutes, but in addition to the new processes that are kind of being put in place, the other kind of thing to really notice is the Gak, so that governmental advisory committee that I pointed out in sort of that Icann organizational slide. This is one of those, advisory committees that advise the board, but, they've been getting plugged in earlier and earlier in the policy process, which I think is a really good development. That was something that kind of was an outgrowth of the new gTLD program that launched in 2012. There was a real feeling that kind of throughout the Gak was kind of late to the table with input and recommendation. Well, really input is mostly what they do. They kind of leave the recommendations part to, how to proceed to Icann and the different, kind of policy teams. But nonetheless, their input was kind of viewed as late to the table. And so they've been working to kind of be a little bit more informed and giving input earlier, which I think is a really good development. But my kind of new barometer for how things are going and kind of timing of things at Icann over the last few years has been, what is the Gak saying? Is the Gak kind of pointing out a number of problems or just maybe one or two? If they're pointing to a number of problems, that probably means it's on a really slow track, that there's a lot of things there that the Governmental Advisory Committee really wants to see worked on. And so you can see here a pretty sizable laundry list of things that they'd really like for, Icann to think about. Everything from kind of the very fragmented disclosure system that's been proposed to, having more enforceable standards to review disclosure decisions, being able to better address consumer protection and consumer trust concerns, the overall just sort of like mechanisms for the SAD that's at issue, financial conditions that will basically, potentially put a disproportionate cost for its use on users that, are trying to do the right thing. So, think of how many requests a cybersecurity researcher might need to make to the SAD, and how if those costs are passed on to users to kind of get that system up and running, that could be pretty sizable cost. And there you're kind of left, trying to decide, is it better to try to protect people and try to get to the bottom of fraud and cybercrime versus the cost of doing that. Also, there's, one of the big issues, the Gak, for, again, as long as I can remember, is just the accuracy of the WHOIS. Like, just because the WHOIS exists, just because there's data there, doesn't mean it's accurate. And there's been tons of studies throughout the time of Icann about the accuracy of WHOIS, and, that continues, the Gak continues to point to that as something, that's still not fixed. And also just, the status and role of each of the data controllers and processors in the process. So if I were a betting lady, I would say this is going very slowly. There's going to be a lot of work here still to do because the Gak has a very sizable list of concerns, and none of them are super easy to address. So definitely, keep your eye on the Gak. So just to kind of wrap this up, there's, these other overarching issues. So when I talked about the kind of new processes that Icann has kind of put at the end of this Epdp Phase Two, before they're going to look at it and approve anything, there is this unresolved issue about the differentiation between a natural versus a legal person when it comes to registration data handling. So I know when I talk to to many brand owners, it's been a little bit confusing why everything seems to be in the Icann world one size fits all. Companies are different than individuals, and kind of the GDPR is really about personal data protection. And so there's been some confusion, or I would say at least some kind of head scratching about, a company still needs to put their WHOIS information because it's not personal data. Why can't registrars figure out how to handle that differently? Well, that type of information differently for natural persons versus legal persons. And it really comes down to the way Icann put out the temporary spec and then kind of has kept that going while these processes have been going on, because it's one size fits all. There's no differentiation. So this is an issue that couldn't be resolved during Phase 2. They're looking at that plus the feasibility of a uniform anonymized registrant email address. So this is now, they're calling this new Phase 2A. I really just call it Phase 3. So that's kind of like one more thing tacked on to the back of this, as well as Icann is now launched. This isn't supposed to be just for Epdp Phase 2. It's apparently something that's going to happen now with all these different policies that require implementation, is to have a new phase between the supporting organization approving it and it being approved by the Icann board. There's going to be this operational design phase process or review. So it's ODP, again, another acronym, prior to Icann board review and approval. And basically, they're supposed to that review is supposed to advise the board as to the cost and the time frame for implementation, so that when they're making a decision, they're making a more informed decision about whether or not this is something that should happen in the way it's been proposed. So this is going to get more interesting in this new phase. While I definitely think it is this information is necessary to make a decision. I'm kind of scratching my head a little bit as to why it's not part of the actual PDP process, that it's actually another phase between kind of it being approved from a supporting organization and before it gets approved, kind of reviewed and approved by the board. So we'll kind of see how this goes. But, yeah, this is going to just elongate it further. So more to come. All right, so let's move on with the ePDP kind of behind us. Now let's move on to another PDP or policy development process going on. It's kind of finally wrapping up, is the Rights Protection Mechanism, or RPM PDP. Another two-phase PDP. Phase 1 covered kind of all the new RPMs applicable in the first round of the new gTLD program in 2012. Phase 2 will focus on reviewing the Uniform Dispute Resolution Policy, or the UDRP, which has been a rights protection mechanism that's been in place since 1999. So it's been with us really since shortly after the inception of Icann. So this is kind of the two phases. They are finished with Phase 1, and it's taken us quite some time to get there. So we did, just to kind of give you kind of some milestones. So in March of 2020, we got the initial report. That was after a couple of years of review. Then they completed the final report in through August through November of 2020. November submitted the final report to GNSO, and then in January of this year, the GNSO approved the final report. Now, like we talked about the Ssr2 report from the Security Stability and Advisory Committee, now that the Icann board has this, they have 6 months to review and approve this PDP recommendations. But I think with this one, this is going to probably be the least controversial, or kind of, I think the review basically showed that these rights protection mechanisms were, were good. Always could be better, but still nothing like that was a complete disaster. There's some likely small incremental changes, but for the most part, it's going to be, for future rounds, the status quo. You're going to have your, the Sunrise stuff, the different, trademark clearinghouse, blockings, those type of things. So actually, the block is not part of it, but the trademark clearinghouse, things like that. All that stuff will stay. So there'll be really very little, probably changes that will come out of this review. Now, the third PDP that's been kind of going on for a while is the new gTLD subsequent procedures PDP, often kind of in a shorthand way referred to as sub-pro PDP. This was another review as a result of the 2012 new gTLD program, and really what they were looking at is kind of the applicant guidebook, which was sort of the, the Bible, if you will, for how to make an application, how they'd be reviewed, how they would be, added to the root server system, the contracting with the new registries. All that stuff is baked into what was called the applicant guidebook. And the sub-pro PDP team was really looking at all those policies and, quite honestly, some of the things that had to get figured out along the way to determine what changes might be needed. Icann had made a commitment to the Gak that they would do a thorough review of the new gTLD program, and that they would review the program, identify what went right, what went wrong, and where there need to be corrective action, that those corrective actions would be made. There's always been some debate about whether or not everything had to be fully fixed before round two, but we'll leave that debate for another day. But this PDP had over 40 separate topics. It broke into 5 work tracks. It was a big undertaking, and, something that, I think everybody in a lot of ways kind of underappreciated, how much work really needed to go into this kind of review. It was unruly at times, but nonetheless, they have gotten through and issued their final report. So just, here's a quick rundown of, when, everything from when the initial report was published back in, July of 2018 through, the final report was published in August of last year. Then, the final recommendations report was published in August. The final work group published its final report in January, and in February of this year, the GNSO approved the final report. Again, Icann has 6 months to review. There's still some very key issues that I think are not crystal clear: closed generics, mandatory and voluntary, what they call PICs, or personal interest commitments that the registries make in terms of what they're going to make, what the registry is going to do to kind of make sure that the TLD is not abused or is not used in an abusive way. And then how the proposed standing predictability implementation review team, which is a new team, and a new acronym on the scene. This is a team that has, kind of been created because there's this fear as like we're going through implementation again that there'll be new questions. And, one of the challenges was last time with the kind of the once people applied, kind of issues kind of kept on popping up as, like how Icann would review the applications, and, like issues like closed generics and singular versus plural strings and things like that. And, the Gak was kind of trying to weigh in real time, but oftentimes they couldn't meet the time frames. And so there's this new, standing predictability implementation review team that's supposed to try to help with this, but now the GAC is kind of scratching their head thinking, so how do we fit into that? Because we still need to provide our input and our advice to the board. So that's going to be a sticky issue. So the good news is, though, there is a likely major victory for brand owners in what's coming out of the sub-pro PDP, and that's really some new mandatory personal interest commitment where the registry operator will not engage in fraudulent or deceptive practices. So, many of you will kind of look, who were involved in, registrations during the kind of the height of the new gTLD program in like 2014, 2015, a little bit of 2016, and somewhat ongoing still. There were some registries that, like some of this, the way they handled kind of premium reserve names, some of the ways that they, kind of handled, who could register. Like the Sunrise registration was really expensive, but then you got to general availability and it was super cheap, and they were kind of threatening, that, brand owners could, there could be these general availability registrations could be, in a way, causing a lot of issues for brand owners. The TLD that comes to mind is DOP feedback was a really big issue during the new gTLD program. But these new personal interest commitments where the registry operator states they will not engage in fraudulent or deceptive practices, this is something seen as, something that will give brand owners some enforceability, something to go after in situations like that. There wasn't anything like that in the contracts. These PICs are in the contracts, and there weren't in the, this type of stuff wasn't in the contracts for the round one new gTLDs, and it really kind of left brand owners feeling like extorted, and often, that the bad guys were sometimes the ones who were winning. So I'm really hopeful that this does kind of change the dynamic a little bit. So if all that wasn't enough, there's a couple of other PDP updates to provide. So one is a new PDP on the scene, which is the transfer PDP. This is a new two-phased PDP that on the transfer policy was announced in February 18th. And this PDP will review the policy governing transfers of domain names from one registrar to another. And this is really when the whole temporary specification went into effect in response to the enforceability of the GDPR in May of 2018, there was a lot of information that became redacted in the WHOIS. And some of that information, particularly like the admin email address, is really important information in the transfer process that is used to send different kind of notices to the kind of different part, the current owner of the domain name. So it kind of broke the transfer process a bit, and so that kind of form of authorization, that was the notice that was sent, is really something that's been part of the transfer process for quite some time. And when it was implemented, it was really meant to kind of make sure that these kind of unauthorized transfers weren't happening, that the current registrant was getting kind of an opportunity to say no. And, now we're effectively, for a transfer, you need to make a request to a registrar and provide them an authorization code, often referred to as an auth code. And there's no ever talking to the registrant and the current registrant. So this has broken the transfer process. It's taken out an important kind of safeguard. And so that's why this PDP, there's kind of a list of several PDPs that need to be launched kind of in light of what's happened with the GDPR. And, a lot of it also hinges on the outcome of some of these ePDP phases. But nonetheless, the transfer one can, we can go back and we can look at the transfer policies and see what can happen here. So that's a new PDP, just getting started, not a lot to report there yet. And then kind of bringing back an old PDP. Some of you will remember the Privacy and Proxy PDP that was just coming to the train station, quite honestly. It finally wrapped up in 2018, like late 2017 or late 2017, and was starting towards the implementation phase, started the implementation phase in 2018, but that train stopped because of this GDPR stuff. And initially it was a temporary stop, and then it was more than temporary, and there's been a lot of brand owners particularly kind of saying, hey, wait a minute, why can't we just continue to move forward? Icann's been pushing back, saying, look, it's really important to see how this ePDP stuff comes out. These things are tightly coupled. We need to work this out. But a lot of the community, myself included, feels like we really need to wrap up this Privacy and Proxy PDP. Let's get this implemented. And then much like transfers, if we need to go back and we need to do some tweaks in light of sort of how the whole ePDP stuff works out, then that's what we should do. But, Privacy and Proxy, that's where, you have, you'll see like the name of another company, a privacy service or something like that, or you'll see somebody else listed as a proxy for a registrant. The challenge is Icann currently does not have any kind of contractual relationship with that privacy or proxy provider, and the registrar that holds the registration, while they may be kind of the operator of that privacy and proxy service, maybe through another company that they own, they are currently not being held accountable for the privacy or proxy providers' kind of wrongdoing and not providing, kind of causing notification of complaints and responding to complaints. So, the Privacy and Proxy PDP really tried to get at trying to fix that, and the implementation is something that many are waiting on. So Icann did promise during Icann 70 that would resume soon, but they haven't given a specific date. So more to come on that, but I think they have held off the masses for long enough, and I think that this is going to reopen that work stream again. All right, now that we've completed our discussion on key PDP updates, I just want to come back to the Gak. I mentioned the Gak throughout, but I want to just come back to them quickly. So just so you get a sense, the Governmental Advisory Committee is now made up of about 178 countries and territories. There's 38 observer organizations and approximately 500 participants or delegates from the Gak. This engagement has really increased throughout the kind of COVID-19 pandemic. You see here there's been 60 new delegates since Icann 66. So in 4 meetings, there's really been a huge increase, biggest increase we've seen in this short of time with the Gak, and really an increased demand for engagement about the virtual environment. And so it's clear that governments are really focusing on the Internet and sort of how the Internet affects the information, the commerce, et cetera, that occurs within their borders and with their residents. So at the end of every Icann meeting, the Gak always issues what they call the Gak Communique. And the Gak will, give their advice, and also in their communique will kind of highlight some issues that they have concerns about or things that they did at the meeting that they want the general public to be really clear about, either their position or what they would like to see done. So one thing the Gak has really kind of put an emphasis on this meeting is that they really want the Icann board to address the public policy concerns outlined in the Gak minority statement to the final report of the Phase 2 ePDP. So this is the very specific advice, and advice, you know, is a special word when it comes to the Gak because that's their kind of mandate to give advice to the Icann board, and when they do, the Icann board is kind of required to look at that and then say, okay, we either agree, we reject, or maybe we have some other question, you know, we need some clarification. But if they reject and the Gak disagrees, that can kind of create a whole other process based on some rules in the Icann bylaws. And we saw that kind of play out when the new gTLD program was launched. But, you know, here are some, you know, I mentioned earlier kind of the public policy concerns they are worried about in the Phase 2 of the ePDP. But basically, they are saying to the board, look, you need to do further work on this, and the board, the Icann board, should assess now how to best address them. Like I said, the Gak gives advice. They typically don't give recommendations. They just tell you, go work on this. They don't go tell you what to do. So we'll see, but this was some very strong advice that the Gak kind of reiterated their comments, public policy comments from the ePDP Phase 2 report. So as I said once before during this presentation, keep your eyes on the Gak. You know, their issues of concern continue to grow, DNS abuse, PICs, RPMs, subsequent procedures, ePDP. Their power and leverage continues to evolve. They're growing. They no longer sit on the sidelines. They really are trying to provide some feedback, some guidance, some inputs. Earlier in the process, they've really embedded representatives in key work streams and policy discussions. So do not underestimate their power and their leverage. And at the end of the day, they have proven themselves to be a check. They see the kind of desire for Icann and the contracted parties to move fast and to kind of like just operate as business as usual with minor tweaks along the edges. The Gak is not going to let that happen. They are really pushing and pulling to make sure that things get addressed and not swept under the rug. So I recognize we've gone probably a couple of minutes long here. It would not be right if I didn't end this presentation with timing on round 2, because after every one of these webinars, I always get asked this question: when is round 2 going to happen? So I think you can tell from this presentation that Icann has to overcome the skepticism of the Gak. Some voices are getting louder about like DNS abuse and the lack of agreed solution on registration data. Subsequent procedures still has a number of policy and implementation, what I call landmines. I know that there's a lot of consultants out there buzzing, saying, oh, it's going to happen in 2022. Oh, you know, all this policy work is done. I'm here to tell you no, that is not the case. I would be surprised if it happens in 2023, but if it does, it would be at the very end of 2023. I think it's likely beyond that. So we'll see. What I'm reading right now is that we've got a little bit ways to still go, and there's some key issues in the Icann world that have to be resolved before all these additional TLDs get introduced. And quite honestly, during this meeting, I heard the Gak say if there needs to be a next round or if there should be another round. Very deliberate, that language. They are really pushing Icann to assess whether or not an additional round of TLDs is really needed now. So more to come. As I said earlier, keep your eyes on the Gak. So with that, I'll turn that over to you, Tarek, and thanks everybody for your time today.
Thanks, Gretchen. That was a great presentation. And that's all the time that we have today. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and we hope to see you next time.